All right, let's get this going. So, I was hoping to upload this on Saturday. Unfortunately, I came down with a head cold and I hadn't recorded it ahead of time. So, I'm going to record it today. It ties into what I was going to put on my blog anyway. So, it feels like a good time to do this. So, I want to talk about marketing for writers. Um, Particularly as it relates to style and genre. And style, I'm using in an idiosyncratic way, which I'll talk about in a bit, but it's something that I learned about during my MFA that I've found really helpful for thinking about what you're writing in the sense of, am I writing something that I'm going to be able to sell to people that people are going to like? Um, because even if you're a great writer, if you don't know what you're writing to in terms of your audience, in terms of your publishers and agents who might be looking for stuff, that can be a pretty significant issue. So, first, what's a market? What do you need to know? How do styles relate to genre and conventions? And what does that mean for you? Um, so, a market is, I think I actually have a slide about this. Um, Style is generally what's your work doing independent of genre. And I'm going to divide it into three categories. These are sort of my definitions, but you'll see other people use slightly different terms for more or less the same thing. Um, Genre is a classification given based on style, form, and contents. And I mean style in the same way as up here, because there are some genres that do have certain attached styles to them. Like magical realism tends to be more literary than mass market, which we'll talk about in a moment. Finally, market is just the population that your book is aimed at. So, for instance, which publishers would like to carry it, which readers are going to read it. That's your market. And I'm sort of combining those into one thing. Typically, when you hear people talk about it in a technical sense, they often care more about publishers than readers. One of the sort of dirty secrets of the industry is that most books don't sell all that well, and so publishers are betting on a long shot rather than expecting every book to make money. So you really are selling your book to the publisher, and if it sells to readers, that's great. Um, so three styles serve as stereotypes. Literary are the styles that you would expect to see rewarded with literary awards. That's not strictly as impossible anymore. There are a lot more awards that aim at different types of novel and different types of book now. Upmarket are the books that people talk about. They're well written, they're well made, they're put out to sort of be coffee table pieces, discussion pieces. Working in my MFA, we read a lot of upmarket fiction as well as literary fiction. Not so much mass market, though we do read some just to sort of see where it's at. Of course, a lot of readers read mass market. Mass market is sort of where the money is, and we'll talk about why there's more money in mass market than some of the other styles. It's not because readers are stupid. All of these three styles have their own sort of defining qualities, and they're all equal in a sense of I like all of them. I don't think there's any problem with choosing to write for one or the other. You just need to know what you're getting into. Um, so, style's a marketing term. When you're talking about literary, upmarket, mass market, those are marketing terms. They're not some particular way of writing per se, though you're gonna see people like you want truth in advertising. Generally, literary is all about accolades, mass market is all about readership, and upmarket is sort of the land in between where you're not necessarily going for just a small group of readers, but you do want people to feel like they're being respected and that it's like an intellectual book. Um, there's a certain false dichotomy here in the sense of popularity tends to lead to acclaim and rewards, whereas being obscure and obtuse cuts into that. Does it really matter what style your book is in? I don't think it matters to the quality, but you want to think about who you're selling it to. You're selling it to a publisher, you're selling it to readers. They need to know whether they're getting an experience that they're going to want to have or an experience that is not what they're expecting. Let's visually compare these three covers of books. These are all what we would call speculative fiction. So they're all sci-fi, post-apocalyptic, uh, sort of that style of genre. Um, Particularly, Never Let Me Go and Leviathan Wakes are sci-fi. Station 11 is post-apocalyptic. Never Let Me Go is a literary novel, and this cover is not my particular favorite. The paperback edition that I have has a cover that's more like this. This is another Kazuo Ishiguro book, The Remains of the Day. Unfortunately, I can't find my copy of Never Let Me Go, so I'm showing that. But you'll notice that it's very abstract, it's very vague, and it has sort of this not particularly topical cover. Um, Whereas Station 11 is upmarket. It has enough evidence that you can kind of see maybe post-apocalyptic, but it doesn't like hammer it at you. You'll notice that it has a National Book Award finalist sticker up on the cover. The original cover is more abstract, and I think that was for the hardcover. I don't know if they changed it for marketing reasons or if they changed it because they just wanted to put the sticker on and have a distinctive cover for the paperback versus the hardcover. Uh, and then finally, we have Leviathan Wakes, which is the first book in The Expanse, which has an awesome TV show. The books are awesome too. I chose these because they're all three of my favorites. Like these would all probably make my top 10 in terms of books or series. But you can sort of tell there's sort of a difference in how they're branded. Literary fiction is less visual and more conceptual. And then when you get to mass market, it's like all visual, all selling on that quality of having action. Literary books tend to be more difficult in the sense of they are built around having you really tackle the text, more complex ideas. One of my favorite books is Milan Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being, and it's a book where you will see transitions between dreams and reality and, you know, thoughts and conversations they would have had. So it's a really difficult book to read, but I think it's quite rewarding for that. Mass market books tend not to have that. Series, likewise, you're going to see that more on the mass market side. That's one of the reasons why mass market makes so much more money than some of these other types, because you can sell 7 books in the Harry Potter series or 9 books in the Expanse series. But sometimes those books and series have a higher quality and they're considered to be mass market instead of upmarket or literary because they're in a series. So if you're marketing yourself as a writer, you may want to think about, in your genre, are series something that cuts into it? For instance, detective novels often have series going back to Sherlock Holmes, and no one really judges detective novels for that. It's sort of like you get used to the characters and it doesn't cut into the quality. Some genres also just don't really have literary. Like, we could probably call Sherlock Holmes literary, and a lot of the other, like Poirot, some of those early detective novels have sort of a literary quality to them in terms of how we would assess them. But we don't typically think of literary fiction often as being what the term genre fiction is used as a pejorative to describe, which is to say that it's more mass market and it fits into a very specific genre where the conventions are specific to that genre. Publishers will have a genre focus and market section that they advertise to. If they're really big, they'll have imprints. Penguin Random House will publish basically any sort of book that you can think of, but they're going to do it from different imprints, just sort of like a branding thing. Not every publisher covers every market. That's for if you're thinking about where you want to sell your book, you should be thinking about, am I going to be sending it somewhere where they are going to be marketing it and treating it and branding it the way that I want it to be received? So if you're doing upmarket writing and you're publishing in a mass market publisher, you need to think about why you're doing that. But again, just sort of up to you. Often smaller publishers have more of a literary and upmarket brand because they don't do giant runs, because they're a little less open. There's this perception of them being very selective. That may or may not be true just depending on which publisher you're going with. Um, Publishers' goals are always going to be the same, and that's they want to sell books. And so when you're thinking about the style and genre that you're working in, you should be thinking about, am I marketing my book in a way that's going to sell? Because that's really the number one thing here. If you're going for very literary, we often have this assumption that contemporary fiction is more prone to be literary, which is not necessarily the case. You want to make sure you're branding properly. If you're sending out query letters to agents, you want to make sure that you've got that in mind of, are they mass market, are they upmarket, are they literary? And the great thing now with internet is that you can typically look up agents and see what their specialty is. But the real thing is just you want to consider where you want to invest your marketing efforts. And there's a couple examples of authors who have very similar works at times that I want to talk about, like Orwell and George Orwell, of course, most famously known for 1984, and Ray Bradbury, who's probably most famously known for Fahrenheit 451, but Bradbury is pretty prolific. They're both generally considered more literary in terms of their canon. Like, we read their books in schools and no one ever gives us guff about it. Versus Heinlein and Le Guin, where their work is often of similar or even greater caliber. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness is like probably the best example of literary science fiction, if you wanted to classify it as such. Like, it's not even upmarket. It's that sophisticated and in-depth. And so Orwell and Bradbury have things that make them thought of more as literary writers. They've, I think, both wrote nonfiction. I might be wrong about that on Bradbury. They have a pretty large catalog of works. Bradbury certainly wrote contemporary fiction. Heinlein and Le Guin tended to be more in the speculative genre, but they still did a lot of the things that we would expect of literary authors in terms of asking big questions about society, having that more character-driven, craft-driven approach. If you've ever read their work, it is incredible the degree to which they are highly sophisticated writers. And so there's a good question here of, in the 21st century, do a lot of these old distinctions still stand? For instance, mass market books often used to be called pulp, based on the idea that they were cheaply printed for everyone to read. And that's like where you got like dime novels and westerns and even Charles Dickens. And so the question there is, well, now we think of Charles Dickens as a literary great. And so in the 21st century, does it really matter how you market your book? In terms of, are you aiming for highbrow or just average people, or I want literally everyone with a pulse to be able to read this? Does it really matter that much anymore? And I think there's some interesting cases to be made either way. But the final takeaway is this. When you're writing your book, you should think about not just your genre, but where you fall in it. If you're going for mass market, think about, hey, is this going to be in a series? That's a great selling point for mass market. If you're going for literary, think about, well, how am I going to show that people who read my books think deeply about them? And that's sort of where you're going. So I think that's it. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to leave them below. Like, subscribe, and I will hopefully have another video up later this week.